Let's bring Paul Rieckhoff in on this, host of the Independent Americans podcast and founder of American Veterans for Ukraine. So in this country, we don't like the idea or the scene of Russian ships gathering, near Cuba, given our history. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, it can feel like Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2.
Let's hope not.
I mean, I think we have to recognize that the Russians do, whether they view it as a threat or not, have ships 90 miles from Florida's border. And the situation in the world has changed. And Ukraine has changed the entire dynamic for the West and the East. And now Russia is solidifying their relationships, not just with Cuba, but also with Venezuela to our south, who's no American ally. They've got deep ties with China, who's all in on Ukraine, and North Korea and others. So what's shaping up is the new axis of evils. And Cuba is always going to be a part of that. Venezuela is always going to be a part of that. And frankly speaking, it's all a threat to the United States, especially in this dynamic environment.
A couple of things while we're talking about it. We'll show the ships in question. I think we have a list of them. And we also, after that, we can put a map up because that's, I think people know this in general. This is what we're talking about with Russia. But the proximity, obviously, is the threat. Between Havana, Cuba, and say, Miami, Florida, and that kind of thing. But this, to you, is all about Ukraine, you think, what's going on here?
Absolutely. And Putin has said that all bets are off and everything is in place. So that's the other factor that's changed here. It's not 10 years ago. Yes, Russian ships make routine stops to Cuba, but Ukraine wasn't happening. Putin wasn't threatening to use nukes. They've got a nuke sub there. I mean, the entire landscape around the world is more volatile. Some view the American military as more vulnerable because we're engaged in other places. We're also preoccupied with the Middle East and our own borders. So if you're the enemy, you're going to try to push and prod in whatever way you can and try to provoke and try to at least elicit a response. And this is also the psychological game that Putin is playing with the world and with his allies to try to corner the United States and to try to press his advantage.
Anything Biden does at G7, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes in more detail, that maybe can counter this and, make a deal with Zelensky, or where are we on Ukraine right now?
I think he's got to continue to do what he did last week at D-Day, which is show there's allies of the world that will stand together in defense of freedom. This is much bigger than Biden. This is about showing America's strength and about our hundreds of years of relationships with NATO allies, the UK, France, and others, in saying that if you do cross lines, if you attack Poland, if you attack a NATO ally, that there is a formidable response that you will face. So it's up to Biden to keep that hold, keep that group tight, and show that it stands strongly against Russia, against China, against North Korea, and against other adversaries.
All right, Paul, if you stand by, I think our next story you'll want to comment on as well, certainly within your area of expertise as we talk about foreign threats. Back to Paul on this here in the studio, and we used to have stories, as you know, especially in this city, all the time in the post-9/11 period that sounded exactly like that. I guess they never really went away, but what would you make of it?
Right, and there are a lot of stories we never heard about because we shouldn't hear about them because they're confidential, they're secure. I think, first of all, good job by ICE and the FBI. Right? I don't think we talk enough about how these folks have kept us safe, since 9/11, time and time again, in many ways we don't know about. So good on them for tracking these guys down and making it a focus. But I think the larger issue remains. We are always under threat from any number of adversaries from all sides, and a porous border where you can't screen people is a vulnerability. We don't have to scaremonger, but we do have to stay vigilant. There's not only people from Tajikistan, but there's folks who are sympathetic with Gaza, who are sympathetic with the Russians. Any number of folks may want to attack Americans. We've got to increase our vigilance. We've got to increase our bipartisanship, I think, in focusing on national security and understand the threats are foreign, but they're also domestic.
And they're made worse, though. In fair, like you said, you don't have to be a scaremonger to say that things are made worse or the risk is higher because of the border crisis, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, it's all intertwined, right? Like, we're engaged in more places around the world. There are more people that hate Americans because of our position on Israel, or because of our support for Ukraine, or any other number of issues. And if you're somebody who wants to attack Americans, you might get on a boat or get on a plane and take the long way all the way around to try to hit people in New York and Los Angeles. That's always been a threat. We felt it, so acutely on 9/11, but that threat hasn't gone away. And we have to remember these folks in the FBI, ICE, CIA, they're on guard every single day, and we've all got to stay vigilant.
We don't talk about it enough. We used to talk about it then, but the old saying that the terrorist only has to be right once, and these guys have to be right all the time. It's amazing how often since, think about it, it's 2024, since 2001, that they've been right and that they've stopped things like this.
That's right. And also, the threat level increases, and there's still vulnerabilities. We're going to have the DNC and the RNC this summer, the political conventions, you've got sporting events. Every single time you have a number of Americans gathering, these folks are on guard. And there are plenty of snipers on rooftops and undercover NYPD and FBI that you never see. And I think they deserve more credit. For 20 years, they've been holding the line. They've been keeping us safe, and they're going to have to continue to do it in the years to come.
All right, Paul, as always, thank you. Watch Paul on the Independent Americans podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, man.